Dying hurts less than you'd think. It's the betrayal that burns. I bled out on a cold concrete floor because of a cheap plastic toy. But then, I woke up. Same sticky summer afternoon. Same park bench. Same whining kid demanding my bamboo copter. Last time, I handed it over and lost everything. This time, I smiled, gripped the cheap plastic tight, and said, "No." You should have seen his mother's face. She didn't just get mad. She looked terrified. Blood tastes like old pennies and regret. That was the last thought that rattled through my skull before the darkness took me. The cold had seeped into my marrow, a freezing, numbing tide that started in my fingertips and rushed toward my failing heart. I had expected a white light. I had expected a profound sense of peace. Instead, there was just a hollow, echoing void, followed by a violent, tearing sensation, like being pulled backward through a keyhole. Then came the heat. It hit me like a physical blow, a suffocating wave of August humidity that tasted of melting asphalt, exhaust fumes, and the sharp, overly sweet tang of burnt sugar. I gasped, sucking in a lungful of stagnant, heavy air. My hands flew to my chest, fingers frantically digging into the fabric of my cotton shirt, searching for the ragged, gaping holes where the bullets had torn through. Nothing. Smooth fabric, intact skin. My ribs ached, but it wasn't from shattered bone. It was from the frantic, desperate thumping of an organ that hadn't quite realized it was allowed to keep beating. I blinked against the sudden, blinding glare of the midday sun. Sweat stung my eyes. The world resolved into sharp, agonizingly bright focus. I was sitting on a park bench. The wood beneath my thighs was blistering hot. The dark green paint peeling away in curled, brittle flakes that stuck to my damp skin. Pigeons were cooing somewhere nearby, a dull, repetitive throatiness that sounded almost mocking. In the distance, the chaotic, tinny music of a cheap carnival carousel spun round and round. I stared at my hands. They were trembling, slick with sweat. I turned them over. There, on the webbing between my left thumb and index finger, the skin was perfectly smooth. The jagged, ugly scar I'd gotten 2 years ago, the one from the shattered beer bottle in a dive bar, was gone. I swallowed hard, my throat feeling like it was lined with sandpaper. I forced myself to look at my left wrist. The cheap digital watch I wore, the one with the cracked screen, stared back at me. July 14th, 2:15 p.m. It was 3 years ago. 3 years to the exact day, to the exact hour. A nauseating wave of vertigo washed over me. I gripped the edge of the bench, my knuckles turning white, fighting the urge to lean over and empty my stomach onto the sun-baked concrete. Rebirth isn't a miracle. It doesn't come with an angelic choir or a sudden surge of heroic purpose. It feels like a sickness. It feels like your brain is violently rejecting the reality it's being forced to process. 2 sets of memories, completely contradictory, were slamming into each other inside my head. I remembered the cold floor of the warehouse. I remembered the heavy boots of the men who had cornered me. I remembered the metallic click of a gun hammer pulling back, and yet here I was, smelling the ozone of an approaching summer thunderstorm, listening to the shrieks of children on a Ferris wheel. My right hand felt cramped. I looked down and realized my fingers were locked in a death grip around a small object, a bamboo copter. It was a flimsy, pathetic little thing, a thin wooden dowel attached to a cheap, injection-molded plastic propeller, painted a garish, toxic shade of neon blue. I had won it not 20 minutes ago, at a rigged balloon dart game near the park's south entrance. The carny running the booth, a twitchy guy with grease under his fingernails and a nervous tick near his left eye, had practically shoved it into my hands when I popped a single balloon, telling me to take my prize and move along. In my first life, I had thought nothing of it, a piece of junk, a momentary distraction. I had walked to this exact bench, sat down to catch my breath in the shade of a dying oak tree, and spun the plastic propeller between my palms, watching it lift a few inches into the air before clattering to the ground. Then she had appeared. The memory hit me with the force of a physical strike. I remembered what was about to happen. I remembered the sequence of events that had turned this utterly mundane afternoon into the first domino in a chain that would ultimately end with my execution on a warehouse floor. I looked at the bamboo copter again. Really looked at it. It was incredibly light. Too light. The blue plastic was scratched, and the wooden dowel had a faint, almost imperceptible seam running down its center, as if two halves had been glued together by someone in a rush. Why? Why had my life been forfeit for this piece of garbage? I didn't have the answers, but the cynical, hardened part of me, the part that had spent 3 years running, hiding, and eventually dying, woke up in a hurry. The fog of confusion burned away, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. I wasn't just back. I was back at the exact intersection where my life had swerved off a cliff. I heard the crunch of gravel on the path to my right. I didn't turn my head immediately. I controlled my breathing, forcing the frantic rise and fall of my chest to slow into an even, relaxed rhythm. I let my shoulders slump, playing the part of a tired, bored man escaping the summer heat. Crunch, crunch. Footsteps, 2 sets. One heavy, deliberate, wearing expensive heels that clicked sharply against the pavement, where the gravel thinned out. The other lighter, scuffing along with the dragging, reluctant gait of a child. I rolled the wooden dowel of the bamboo copter between my thumb and forefinger. The wood felt rough, raw. I stared straight ahead at the shimmering heat waves rising off the duck pond, waiting for the shadows to fall across my path. "Excuse me," a voice said. Smooth, cultured, edged with a perfectly calibrated amount of polite hesitation. I slowly turned my head. It was time to meet the architect of my ruin. Beatrice stood there, exactly as I remembered her. If you were to look up affluent suburban anxiety in a dictionary, her picture would be there. She was dressed in a cream-colored linen sundress that probably cost more than my rent, paired with oversized tortoiseshell sunglasses that swallowed the upper half of her face. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a messy bun that had clearly taken an hour in front of a mirror to look effortlessly disheveled. But it was the sensory details that betrayed the image she was trying so desperately to project. The oppressive heat of the park was getting to her. A faint, glistening sheen of sweat rested in the hollow of her collarbone. Her perfume, something heavy, floral, and aggressively expensive, wafted toward me, but beneath the synthetic scent of lilies and bergamot, there was the sharp, sour tang of nervous perspiration. She was breathing just a little too fast. Her hands, clutching a buttery leather tote bag, were rigid, the knuckles showing white through the tanned skin. Hiding behind her leg was the boy, Leo. He looked to be about 6 years old, dressed in a miniature polo shirt and khaki shorts. He was kicking at the dirt with a designer sneaker, his face scrunched into a theatrical mask of misery. "I'm so sorry to bother you," Beatrice continued, her lips stretching into a tight, practiced smile that didn't even attempt to reach her hidden eyes. It's incredibly hot, and we've been walking for hours, and my son—" She trailed off, gesturing vaguely downward with one perfectly manicured hand. Right on cue, Leo let out a high-pitched, reedy whine. He pointed a sticky, unwashed finger directly at my hand. "I want that one. The blue one. You promised, Mommy." I looked from the boy to the mother, letting the silence stretch for a fraction of a second longer than was polite. In my first life, this was the moment I had folded. I had looked at this woman, seen the exhaustion in her posture, heard the grating whine of a tired child, and I had felt empathy. Empathy. What a useless, fatal emotion. I had thought she was just a mother, at the end of her rope, desperately trying to quiet a tantrum so she could salvage a miserable afternoon in the park. When she offered to buy the cheap toy off me for a $20 bill, claiming her son had a specific fixation on blue helicopters, I had laughed, handed it over, and told her to keep her money. I had been so terribly, terribly blind. Now, with the benefit of hindsight and a memory of a bullet tearing through my chest, I watched the performance with a cynical eye. The cracks were glaringly obvious. First, the child wasn't throwing a real tantrum. A real child throwing a fit over a toy is a force of nature. There are tears, there is screaming, there is an absolute, localized loss of gravity and reason. Leo wasn't crying. His eyes were dry. He was looking at the bamboo copter, not with the manic desire of a child wanting to play, but with the focused instruction of an actor hitting his mark. He pointed, he whined, but his body language was bored. Second, Beatrice's posture was all wrong. When a mother is dealing with a public meltdown, her attention is on the child. She is either trying to soothe them, scold them, or ignore them out of embarrassment. Beatrice hadn't looked at Leo once. Her head was angled downward, yes, but behind the dark lenses of those oversized sunglasses, I could feel her gaze locked onto my hands, locked onto the blue plastic. She was a predator pretending to be prey. "He's just absolutely fixated on that little toy you have there," Beatrice said, her voice dropping an octave, trying to manufacture a tone of conspiratorial camaraderie. "We're both adults here. Surely you understand how irrational children are. We went to the carnival, but they were completely out of the blue ones. He's been inconsolable. A lie. A stupid, desperate lie. The carny had a cardboard box overflowing with neon blue copters right beneath his counter. Is that right?" I kept my voice flat, devoid of the warmth I had offered in my past life. I didn't smile. I just looked at her, letting my eyes drop down to the leather bag, then back up to her face. The lack of immediate compliance threw her off rhythm. Her rigid smile faltered for a microsecond before she pasted it back on. "Yes," she laughed, a brittle, breathy sound that grated against the humid air. "It's silly, I know, but you know how kids are. Look, I don't want to ruin your afternoon. How about I just buy it from you? I'll give you $20 for it. It's more than it's worth, I know, but you'd really be saving me a headache." She didn't reach for her purse. She was testing the waters, waiting for the social contract of polite society to kick in. The expectation was that I would wave the money away, act the gentleman, and hand the toy to the boy. I looked down at the bamboo copter in my hand. I ran my thumb over the seam on the wooden dowel again. The rough edge caught against my skin. There was something inside this wood. I was holding a dead drop. The carny at the balloon dart booth wasn't just handing out cheap prizes. He was passing off information. I must have walked up at the exact time the real contact was supposed to arrive. I fit the description, or I was just wearing a similar shirt, and he handed me a death sentence wrapped in neon plastic. Beatrice wasn't a random mother. She was the retrieval team. $20, I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the heavy air. Or 50, she said quickly, the words tumbling out of her mouth before she could stop them. The polite mask was cracking. The desperation was bleeding through. $50, please. Just let me take it off your hands. I looked at Leo. The kid was still pointing his finger, frozen in his pose, waiting for his mother to finish the transaction. I shifted my weight on the bench, leaning forward slightly. I felt a grim, dark satisfaction welling up in my chest. For 3 years, I had been the victim of forces I didn't understand. I had been hunted like an animal. Now, the power dynamic was entirely in my hands, resting in the weight of a 3-cent piece of wood. I looked Beatrice dead in the center of her expensive sunglasses. No, the word hung in the stifling summer air, sharp and absolute. It didn't echo, but its impact was seismic. I'm sorry, Beatrice stammered, her voice losing its cultured smoothness, pitching up into a reedy squeak of genuine confusion. I said no, I replied, my tone conversational but utterly immovable. I leaned back against the peeling green paint of the bench, deliberately crossing one leg over the other. I held the bamboo copter loosely in my lap, not hiding it, just resting my hand over the blue propeller. For 3 agonizing seconds, time seemed to stand completely still. I watched the cognitive dissonance short-circuit her brain. This wasn't in the script. People didn't refuse $50 for a piece of carnival garbage. They certainly didn't refuse an affluent, pleading mother. Then, the physical reaction hit her. It was astonishing to watch. I had read about people turning pale with fear, but to see it happen in real time, beneath the glaring sun, was something else entirely. It was as if a valve had been opened at the base of her neck, draining the blood from her face in one sudden, rushing motion. Her skin went from a healthy, sun-kissed tan to the color of old parchment. It was a sickly, waxy white that made the blue veins at her temples stand out in stark, terrifying relief. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Behind the dark lenses of her sunglasses, I knew her pupils were dilating in sheer, primal panic. She wasn't just surprised. She was terrified. And in that terror, I read 100 silent confessions. I realized that if she didn't get this toy back to whoever sent her, the consequences for her were dire. Maybe lethal. This wasn't just a retrieval mission. It was a desperate attempt to fix a catastrophic error. The carney had given the drop to the wrong man, and Beatrice had been sent to intercept me before I left the park. Look, she finally choked out, her voice trembling so badly she had to clear her throat. She stepped closer, invading my personal space. The sour smell of her nervous sweat completely overpowered the floral perfume now. It smelled like raw adrenaline and fear. I'll give you $100, $200, whatever is in my purse right now. Just give me the toy. She reached out, her hand trembling violently, the manicured nails suddenly looking like desperate claws, darted toward my lap. My reflexes, honed by 3 years of running for my life in a timeline she had created, took over. Before she could even brush the fabric of my jeans, my hand clamped around her wrist. I didn't squeeze hard enough to break skin, but I applied enough pressure to let her know she had hit a concrete wall. Her skin was freezing cold despite the 90-degree heat. She gasped, pulling back, but I held on for a fraction of a second longer, forcing her to lean in, forcing her to realize exactly how out of her depth she was. "It's not for sale," I said, dropping my voice to a harsh, quiet rasp. I stripped away every ounce of polite societal pretense. I let the cynical, tired ghost of my murdered self look out through my eyes. "And if you ever reach for me again, you're going to lose a lot more than a piece of plastic. Do you understand me?" I released her wrist. She stumbled backward as if she'd been burned, nearly tripping over Leo, who had finally dropped his fake whining act and was staring at me with wide, genuinely frightened eyes. Beatrice's chest was heaving. Her polished facade had completely shattered. She wasn't an affluent mother anymore. She was a cornered animal staring at an apex predator she had mistaken for a mouse. Her eyes darted wildly around the park, not looking for the police, but looking over her shoulder, scanning the tree line, scanning the paths. She was looking for her handlers. She was looking to see if anyone had witnessed her catastrophic failure. I didn't wait around for her to formulate a backup plan. I stood up. I was a good 6 inches taller than her, and I used every bit of that height to loom over her for one final, silent second. Then, I turned on my heel and walked away. I didn't run. Running invites pursuit. I walked with deliberate, measured strides down the gravel path, heading deeper into the park, toward the dense cluster of oak trees and the public restrooms near the amphitheater. My senses were dialed up to 11. The crunch of gravel beneath my boots sounded deafening. The cicadas buzzing in the branches sounded like a circular saw. The air felt thick, heavy with impending violence. Every person I passed, an old man feeding ducks, a couple arguing on a blanket, a teenager aggressively pedaling a bicycle, was subjected to a rapid, paranoid threat assessment. Are you with her? Are you the backup? I reached the brutalist concrete block of the public restrooms. The men's room was empty. It smelled of industrial bleach, stale urine, and damp concrete. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered with an angry, buzzing hum. I walked over to the bank of sinks, stared at my reflection in the spotted, grime-covered mirror, and took a deep, shuddering breath. The man looking back at me looked the same as he had this morning, but his eyes were ancient. I looked down at the bamboo copter in my hand. It was time to find out what I had died for. I gripped the blue plastic propeller with my left hand and the thickest part of the wooden dowel with my right. I braced my elbows against the edge of the ceramic sink and applied pressure, twisting and bending simultaneously. The wood resisted for a moment, then gave way with a sharp, echoing crack. The dowel split perfectly down the middle seam. It was hollow. I tapped the broken halves against the porcelain sink. A tiny, metallic object clattered against the ceramic, skittering to a halt near the drain. I leaned in closely. It was a micro SD card, scarcely larger than a fingernail, wrapped in a thin layer of protective silicone. I stared at the tiny black square, feeling the blood pound in my ears. This was it, the alpha and omega of my misery. A few gigabytes of data that had been worth a bullet in my chest. I picked it up, feeling its sharp edges press into my fingerprint. I didn't know what was on it yet. Financial records? Blackmail? State secrets? It didn't matter right now. What mattered was that the game had changed. Beatrice and whoever held her leash thought they were dealing with a random civilian who had accidentally stumbled into their dead drop. They had no idea they were dealing with a ghost who already knew how the story ended. I slipped the memory card into the coin pocket of my jeans, threw the broken pieces of the bamboo copter into the trash can, and walked out into the suffocating summer heat. The war had just started, but this time I had the high ground. Leaving the park felt like wading through wet cement. Every step required a deliberate, exhausting command from my brain to my muscles. My boots scraped against the hot pavement, a harsh, dragging sound that seemed to scream my location to anyone listening. The suffocating August heat was still there, baking the city into a hazy, shimmering oven. But I was shivering. A cold sweat plastered my shirt to my spine. The adrenaline crash was finally hitting, leaving a sour, metallic taste in the back of my throat and a tremor in my hands that I couldn't suppress. I merged into the dense flow of pedestrian traffic on the main avenue, keeping my head down. I used the anonymity of the sweltering, irritated crowd as a temporary shield. A bus roared past, coughing a thick cloud of diesel exhaust into my face. I inhaled the acrid fumes and let the harsh reality of the smell ground me. I was alive. My lungs burned, my legs ached, and my heart hammered against my ribs. I wasn't a corpse rotting on a warehouse floor, but I would be if I didn't move fast. In my past life, after handing over the bamboo copter to Beatrice, I had simply walked back to my cramped apartment, completely oblivious to the crosshairs painting my back. It took them 3 days to manufacture a reason to ruin me. 3 days of silent surveillance before the frame-up began. Drugs planted in my locker at the auto shop. A sudden, violent police raid. My bail being mysteriously paid by a shell corporation, throwing me back out onto the street where the real wolves were waiting. They had taken their time because they had what they wanted. The drop was secure. I was just a loose end they needed to tie up quietly. A random mechanic who might have peeked inside a hollow piece of wood. This time, I had kept the prize. The timeline was shattered. Beatrice was panicking, which meant she was calling her handlers right now. They wouldn't wait 3 days. They wouldn't bother framing me. They would come with guns, and they would come today. I ducked into a narrow, shadowed alleyway, smelling fiercely of rotting cabbage and stale beer. I leaned against the cool, damp brick of a restaurant's rear wall and pulled the micro SD card from my pocket. It was so impossibly small. It barely covered the pad of my index finger. I rolled it between my thumb and forefinger, feeling the sharp plastic edges, a speck of black dust that carried a death sentence. I needed to know what was on it. I couldn't fight an enemy I didn't understand. Going home was suicide. Going to a public library required a login and left a digital footprint. I needed hardware that couldn't be traced, and I needed a place where nobody asked questions. 40 minutes later, I pushed open the heavy glass door of a pawn shop on the ragged edge of the industrial district. The bell above the door chimed, a sad, flat sound. The air inside was cool, heavily conditioned, and smelled of ozone, dust, and desperate transactions. Glass display cases were crammed with tarnished jewelry, power tools caked in drywall dust, and rows of outdated electronics. The guy behind the counter looked like he had been built out of spare parts. Thick, heavily tattooed arms, a shaved head, and eyes that had seen every flavor of human misery and found it boring. "I need a laptop," I said, keeping my voice flat. "Old. Doesn't need to be fast. Just needs a functioning SD card reader and a battery that holds a charge for an hour." He didn't speak. He just turned, grabbed a chunky, scuffed-up Dell from a stack of identical machines, and dropped it onto the glass counter with a heavy thud. He tossed a tangled power cord next to it. $80, as is, no returns. I pulled 4 crumpled $20 bills from my wallet, almost half of what I had to my name. and slid them across the glass. He snatched the cash, barely glancing at it before stuffing it into a register. No receipt, no names. Perfect. I bought a cheap plastic SD to USB adapter from a dusty bin near the register, grabbed the laptop, and walked back out into the blistering heat. I didn't stop moving until I found a cheap motel 2 miles down the highway. The neon sign out front buzzed angrily, the M flickering in a perpetual state of dying. I paid for a single night in cash to a bored teenager chewing gum behind bulletproof glass. Room 114, ground floor, back of the building, facing a rusted chain-link fence and a line of overgrown scrub pines. I unlocked the hollow wooden door and stepped inside. The room was bathed in the sickly yellow glow of a single lamp. It smelled of heavy industrial carpet cleaner, attempting and failing to mask years of stale cigarette smoke. I locked the door, slid the chain into place, and pulled the faded floral curtains tightly shut. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, the springs groaning in protest. I placed the chunky laptop on the wobbly veneer nightstand and pressed the power button. The machine whirred to life, the fan sounding like a small aircraft engine struggling for altitude. I waited, the seconds stretching into an agonizing eternity as the ancient operating system slowly loaded. My stomach was a tight, painful knot. My mouth was dry. Finally, the desktop appeared. I took a deep breath, inserted the tiny micro SD card into the cheap plastic adapter, and shoved it into the laptop's USB port. A sharp, digital chime broke the silence of the room. A folder icon popped up on the screen. Removable disk, E:. I hovered the trackpad arrow over the icon. My finger hesitated. Once I opened this, I couldn't unsee it. I was stepping over the threshold, moving from an accidental bystander to an active participant in whatever nightmare this was. I clicked twice. The folder opened. There were no passwords, no layers of sophisticated encryption. Just a raw, unorganized dump of files. Whoever had put this together was either incredibly arrogant or moving so fast they didn't have time to cover their tracks properly. I stared at the harsh, blue-white glare of the screen, the light reflecting in my eyes, making them water. The fan on the pawnshop laptop whined, spitting hot air against my wrist. There were dozens of folders. Most of them were labeled with dates going back 4 years, accompanied by strings of alphanumeric codes. I clicked on the most recent one. Spreadsheets. Endless columns of numbers, dates, and account routing information. It looked like a standard accounting ledger, but the amounts were staggering. 7 figures, 8 figures, moving rapidly through offshore accounts in the Caymans, Cyprus, and the Isle of Man. I am no forensic accountant, but I know how to spot a wash cycle. The money was being fractured, bounced across the globe, and reconstituted into legitimate holdings. I backed out and clicked on another folder. This one contained PDFs, invoices, shipping manifests, and land deeds. My eyes scanned the documents, searching for a common denominator. It took 3 files before a name jumped out at me, bolded and repeated with terrifying frequency. Caldwell Enterprises. The name hit me like a physical punch to the gut. Everyone in the city knew the Caldwells. They owned the shipping ports. They owned half the real estate downtown. They funded the mayor's campaigns and donated millions to the Children's Hospital. They were untouchable. Victor Caldwell, the patriarch, was a man whose smile could freeze water. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. I clicked on a subfolder labeled Project Reclamation. It was full of photographs. I opened the first image. It was a high-resolution drone shot of a massive, desolate plot of land outside the city limits. The old industrial rail yards that Caldwell Enterprises had bought up years ago, promising to build low-income housing. I clicked to the next image. It was taken at ground level, at night. Harsh floodlights illuminated a massive, jagged trench dug into the earth. Men in full hazmat suits were directing heavy machinery. They were burying hundreds of rusted, unmarked steel drums. I kept clicking. The photos documented a massive, illegal dumping operation. Chemical waste, toxic runoff from Caldwell's manufacturing plants, buried directly over the city's secondary aquifer. Then came the medical reports. My breath caught in my throat. The air in the motel room suddenly felt too thick to breathe. There were dozens of pages detailing blood panels, toxicology screens, and autopsy reports. The subjects were all residents of the low-income neighborhoods bordering the old rail yards. Children with aggressive, inexplicable clusters of leukemia. Adults suffering from sudden neurological collapse. The Caldwells weren't just embezzling money. They were poisoning the ground, killing people to save millions in waste disposal costs, and then laundering the profits to pay off the environmental inspectors and local politicians. And Beatrice? I dug deeper, finding an organizational chart hidden in a file labeled Logistics. There she was, Beatrice Thorne. Not a helpless mother. She was listed as the primary liaison for the cleanup crew. The fixer. Her job was to make sure the right people got paid, to look the other way, and the wrong people disappeared. I sat back, the springs of the mattress groaning. I rubbed my hands over my face, feeling the rough stubble on my jaw, the sheer, crushing weight of it all pressed down on my shoulders. In my past life, I had died for a ledger. I had been dragged into a warehouse, beaten until my ribs splintered, and shot in the chest, all because some terrified whistleblower, probably the guy who got too close to the chemical drums and realized he was coughing up blood, had tried to smuggle this evidence to a journalist or a federal agent. The balloon dart carney was just the middleman. I was just the idiot wearing the wrong shirt at the wrong time. A bitter, cynical laugh clawed its way up my throat. It was a harsh, ugly sound that startled me. I wasn't a hero. I was a grease monkey who spent his weekends fixing transmissions and drinking cheap beer. I didn't want to save the world. I didn't care about bringing down empires. But I cared about the hole in my chest. I cared about the memory of my own blood pooling on concrete. I cared about the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of people who thought my life was worth less than a piece of plastic. I looked back at the screen. The evidence was damning. If this got out, the Caldwell empire would burn to ash. Victor Caldwell would spend the rest of his life in a concrete box, and Beatrice would be right there next to him. But I couldn't just hand it over to the police. The local precinct was likely on the Caldwell payroll. A federal drop required time and connections I didn't possess. If I exposed myself to hand this over, I'd be dead before the 6 o'clock news aired. No, I couldn't play by the rules. The rules were written by the people trying to kill me. I pulled the SD card from the reader. The digital chime rang out again. I slipped the tiny piece of plastic back into my pocket, feeling its weight like a physical anchor. I needed to see if they were taking the bait. I needed to know how the Caldwell machine operated when it was panicked. I closed the laptop, stuffed it into my duffel bag, and stood up. The fear was still there, cold and sharp in my belly, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was morphing, twisting into something darker, something harder. I wasn't the prey anymore. I was a ghost, and ghosts don't run. They haunt. twilight brought a heavy, bruised sky that threatened rain, but stubbornly refused to deliver. The city was trapped under a dome of stagnant, humid air. I sat in the cab of a rusted-out Ford pickup truck I had hot-wired an hour ago from a long-term parking lot near the airport. The leather bench seat was cracked and smelled faintly of wet dog and stale tobacco. I was parked in a narrow alleyway directly across the street from my own apartment building. It was a crumbling, 4-story brick walk-up in a neighborhood where nobody asked questions because nobody wanted the answers. Streetlights flickered erratically, casting long, jaundiced shadows across the cracked pavement. I slouched low in the driver's seat, the engine off, the windows rolled down an inch to let the suffocating heat escape. I watched the front entrance of my building through a pair of cheap binoculars I'd bought at a camping supply store. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, corner unit. The lights were off. It looked perfectly normal, perfectly abandoned. I checked my watch. The cracked screen glowed faintly in the gloom. 8:15 p.m. It had been 6 hours since I walked away from Beatrice in the park. In my old life, I'd be sitting on my torn sofa right now, eating cold takeout and watching a static-filled TV, completely unaware that the clock was ticking down on my existence. A drop of sweat rolled down my temple, stinging my eye. I didn't wipe it away. I kept the binoculars locked on the heavy metal security door of the building. The waiting was the hardest part. The silence in the truck cab was deafening, broken only by the distant wail of a siren and the erratic thumping of my own pulse. Doubts began to creep in, whispering toxic questions in the back of my mind. What if you miscalculated? What if they don't know who you are? What if you're sitting out here for nothing while they track your burner laptop? I forced the thoughts down, burying them under a layer of cold, rational logic. Beatrice had seen my face. The carny at the park had seen me. In a city wired with traffic cameras and an unlimited budget, finding a guy who fits a description isn't hard for an outfit like Caldwell Enterprises. They would find me. The only question was when. At 8:42 p.m., a sleek, black SUV rolled onto my street. It didn't belong in this neighborhood. It moved too smoothly, the tinted windows swallowing the ambient light. It cruised past my building at a crawl, the engine emitting a low, powerful purr. It drove to the end of the block, turned around, and came back, finally pulling flush against the curb directly in front of the fire hydrant near my building's entrance. My grip on the binoculars tightened until my knuckles ached. 2 men stepped out of the vehicle. They didn't look like mobsters from a movie. They didn't wear tailored suits or carry violin cases. They looked like municipal workers. They wore faded navy blue work jackets, heavy boots, and dark baseball caps pulled low over their faces. One of them carried a heavy canvas tool bag. They moved with terrifying, practiced efficiency. No hesitation. No looking around to see if they were being watched. They walked straight up to the security door. The man with the tool bag pulled something out, a magnetic cloner or a master key. I couldn't tell from this distance. And within 3 seconds, the heavy metal door clicked open. They slipped inside, the door shutting silently behind them. I lowered the binoculars. My chest felt hollow. Validation is a bitter pill to swallow when it confirms you are marked for death. They hadn't waited 3 days. They hadn't bothered with the police raid or the planted drugs. My refusal to hand over the bamboo copter had escalated the threat level. They weren't here to frame me. They were here to erase me. I shifted my gaze to the 3rd-floor windows of my apartment. 1 minute passed. 2. Then, a faint, Erratic flickering of light danced across the drawn blinds of my living room. Flashlights. They were moving through my home, tossing my belongings, searching my drawers, ripping open my mattress, looking for a piece of cheap blue plastic. I pictured them standing in my cramped kitchen, stepping over my worn-out boots. I imagined the cold, clinical violence in their eyes when they realized the apartment was empty. A hot, dark rage flared in my chest, burning away the last remnants of fear. These men, and the people who sent them, viewed my life as a clerical error, a minor inconvenience to be scrubbed from the ledger. They thought they were hunting a terrified mechanic who was probably cowering in a bus station, waiting to be found. They didn't know the rules of engagement had changed. They didn't know the man they were looking for was sitting 50 yards away, watching them walk into a cage. I reached into the passenger seat and picked up a heavy, black, prepaid cell phone. I had bought it an hour ago, paying a premium to a corner bodega owner to activate it under a fake name. I punched in a number I had memorized from the documents on the SD card. It was the direct line to Beatrice's office at Caldwell Logistics. I knew she wouldn't be there at this hour, but I knew the call would be forwarded to her personal mobile. The phone rang once, twice. Yes? Her voice was tight, vibrating with a high wire tension that brought a grim smile to my face. She sounded exhausted. She sounded hunted. "Your plumbers are very efficient," I said, my voice dropping to a low, gravelly rasp. I watched the flashlights beam through the window of my bedroom. But they're looking in the wrong drain. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Total, paralyzing silence. I could hear the faint sound of traffic in the background on her end. She was on the move. "Who is this?" she finally whispered. The cultured, affluent mask was completely gone. She sounded like a cornered rat. "I'm the guy who kept the toy," I replied, leaning back against the cracked leather seat, watching my apartment burn in the dark. "And I've seen the photos, Beatrice. I've seen the dirt you're burying. Listen to me," she hissed, the panic exploding into her voice. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. You are playing with fire. If you give it back right now, I can make sure you walk away. I swear to you. Name your price. Just tell me where you are." "I'm everywhere," I said softly. "Call off your dogs. If I see them in my neighborhood again, the files go to every major news outlet on the coast. You have 24 hours to gather $10 million in untraceable bearer bonds." $10 million? You're insane. I can't get that. "Then you'd better start looking for a country that doesn't have an extradition treaty," I said smoothly. I didn't wait for her response. I ended the call, pulled the battery out of the phone, and tossed both pieces out the truck window into the dark, wet alley. I put the truck in drive and slowly pulled away from the curb, leaving my old life behind in the rearview mirror. I didn't want their money. The demand was just a smokescreen, a way to keep them panicked, bleeding resources, and looking in the wrong direction. The war had begun, and I was going to burn Caldwell Enterprises to the ground. One piece at a time, rain finally broke the city's fever just before dawn. It didn't fall. It slammed into the motel's aluminum roof like handfuls of gravel, washing the stifling humidity down the gutters. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, watching the water streak the dirty window pane. The pawnshop laptop hummed a strained, high-pitched tune on the nightstand. My eyes felt like they were filled with crushed glass. I hadn't slept a single second. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the cold concrete of the warehouse floor against my cheek and tasted my own blood. I took a slow sip of black coffee from a styrofoam cup. It tasted like battery acid, and burnt paper, but the caffeine was a necessary violence against my own exhaustion. Revenge is a terrible roommate. It demands all your attention and feeds on your paranoia. I couldn't just hand the SD card over to the police. Victor Caldwell owned the police. He owned the mayor. If I walked into a precinct with this drive, the evidence would disappear into a lockup room, and I would disappear into a holding cell, where an off-duty deputy would casually strangle me with my own shoelaces. I needed to bypass the local machinery entirely. I needed to build a fire so massive that Caldwell's money couldn't buy enough water to put it out. I plugged the micro SD card back into the cheap reader and started sorting. The financial ledgers were complex, requiring forensic accountants to truly unravel. The illegal land deeds were bureaucratic and boring, but the medical records, the photos of the toxic waste barrels being buried next to the city's secondary water supply, that was raw. That was visceral. I didn't send everything. You don't hunt a bear by throwing all your rocks at once. You bleed it. You make it paranoid. You make it exhaust itself. I used a heavily encrypted, browser-based email service, routing my connection through 3 different free VPNs. I compiled a tight, undeniable package: 5 photos of the chemical drums, the coordinates of the burial trench, and a cross-reference list of the leukemia clusters in the adjacent neighborhood. I didn't send it to the major networks. They had legal departments that would spend weeks vetting the source, giving Caldwell time to file injunctions. Instead, I sent it to Arthur Penhaligon. He was a disgruntled, borderline alcoholic investigative reporter for an independent digital publication that survived on sensationalism and spite. He hated the city's elite, and more importantly, he had a massive, angry readership. I attached a single line of text to the email: "Dig exactly where the red X is, Arthur, and bring a Geiger counter." I hovered my trembling finger over the trackpad. Hitting send felt like pulling the pin on a grenade and holding it in my hand. Once this was out, the ghost timeline was fully dead. There was no going back to being a grease monkey. There was only the fire. My finger tapped the plastic. Message sent. I closed the laptop and shoved it into my duffel bag. I couldn't stay in this motel. They would be tracking cell towers, monitoring local bandwidth spikes, looking for anomalies. I grabbed my keys, walked out into the torrential downpour, and climbed back into the stolen Ford pickup. By noon, the story broke. I was sitting in a dingy diner on the outskirts of the industrial district, picking at a plate of rubbery scrambled eggs. The small television mounted above the counter, usually tuned to daytime soap operas, abruptly flashed to a breaking news banner. Arthur Penhaligon hadn't just published an article. He had driven out to the old rail yards with a camera crew and a rented backhoe. The volume was muted, but the images spoke for themselves. The camera panned over a jagged, muddy crater in the earth. Buried halfway in the wet clay were rows of rusting steel drums, neon orange hazard warning labels, clearly visible through the grime. The feed cut to an enraged Penhaligon, pointing at a sheaf of medical records. Below him, the ticker tape scrolled violently. Caldwell Enterprises linked to toxic dump site. Cancer clusters discovered in neighboring district. A cold, heavy knot of satisfaction tightened in my stomach. The diner grew dead quiet. 2 truckers, sitting a few stools down, stopped eating, their forks hovering halfway to their mouths, staring at the screen. The machine was bleeding. I walked out to the payphone in the diner's vestibule. The receiver was sticky, smelling of stale breath and cheap cologne. I dropped a handful of quarters into the slot and dialed the direct line to Beatrice's office. It didn't even ring. It went straight to a busy signal. The switchboards were melting down. I smiled, a tight, ugly expression that hurt my face. I waited an hour, bought a burner phone from a gas station across the street, and dialed her personal mobile number. She picked up on the first ring. "I told you 10 million, I said, pitching my voice low, letting the ambient noise of the passing highway wash over the receiver. "You son of a bitch," she hissed. Her voice was unrecognizable. The polished, affluent veneer had been burned away by sheer, unadulterated panic. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The SEC is freezing our accounts. The EPA is cordoning off the site. Victor is going to kill me. He is going to literally kill me. I asked for 10 million. I repeated, cold and steady. "I only released the first chapter, Beatrice. I still have the financial ledgers. I have the bribery logs for the city inspectors. I have the names of every politician on Caldwell's payroll." Silence on the line, save for her ragged, hyperventilating breaths. "We don't have 10 million in bearer bonds." She finally choked out. "The accounts are locked down. The board is panicking. I scraped together 2 million in untraceable cash. That's it. That's everything I could pull from the emergency slush funds before the feds started watching the ledgers. 2 million, I mused, leaning against the smudged glass of the phone booth. "It's a steep discount for your life. It's all there is," she screamed, the sound distorting the cheap speaker of the burner phone. "Take it and give me the drive. Please, if you release the ledgers, I have nowhere to run." I closed my eyes. The rational part of my brain, the mechanic who used to worry about rent and groceries, was screaming at me to take the money and disappear to Mexico. $2 million was a ghost's ransom. But then I remembered the hollow thump of a silencer. I remembered the absolute contempt in the eyes of the men who had murdered me. They didn't just kill me. They had erased me without a second thought, treating my existence like a piece of chewing gum stuck to their shoe. Money wouldn't fix that. Only absolute ruin would. "Union Station," I said. "Tonight, 6 p.m., rush hour. You come alone. You bring the bag. You stand by the central arrivals board. If I see a single tailored suit, a single earpiece, or anyone who looks like they know how to hold a gun, the ledgers go to the New York Times. I'll be there," she whispered, sounding like a dying woman. I hung up, snapped the burner phone in half, and dropped it into a trash can. I wasn't going to take her money. I was going to use it to dig her grave. Union Station at 6 p.m. is a masterclass in human friction. Thousands of exhausted, irritable commuters pack the vaulted marble halls, moving in dense, intersecting rivers of briefcases and wet raincoats. The air smells of damp wool, roasted peanuts from a vendor cart, and the sharp, metallic tang of the trains breaking on the tracks below. It is loud, the echoing announcements, the clatter of shoes, the collective murmur of 1,000 private conversations. It creates a wall of white noise. It was the perfect place to hide. I stood on the second-floor mezzanine, leaning against a brass railing, holding a lukewarm cup of coffee. I wore a gray hoodie, a faded baseball cap, and a medical mask. In a post-pandemic city, nobody looks twice at a masked face. I blended perfectly into the exhausted masses. Below me, the central arrivals board clicked and whirred, massive black panels flipping over to display updated times. At 5:55 p.m., Beatrice arrived. She looked entirely broken. The linen sundress from yesterday was gone, replaced by a dark trench coat that looked too heavy for the muggy weather. Her blonde hair was tied back in a harsh, severe knot. The oversized sunglasses remained, but I could see the rigid tension in her jaw. She was clutching a large, heavy, leather duffel bag against her chest like a life preserver. She walked to the center of the concourse, right beneath the arrivals board, and stopped. She was a solitary island in a rushing river of people. I watched her for 2 minutes. Then I began scanning the crowd. She had sworn she was coming alone. I knew she was lying. Beatrice was a cornered animal, and cornered animals bite. It took me another minute to spot them. The first guy was leaning against a pillar near the ticketing kiosks, pretending to read a newspaper. He was too still. His eyes weren't tracking the text. They were sweeping the crowd in methodical, trained arcs. His right hand was tucked into his jacket pocket. The second guy was harder to find. He was sitting on a wooden bench near the escalator, dressed like a businessman, but his shoes gave him away. Nobody wears tactical boots with a $2,000 suit. They were waiting for me to approach her. The moment I touched that bag, they would close in, pump 3 silenced rounds into my spine, and melt back into the rush hour chaos. I pulled my second burner phone from my pocket. I had bought 3 in total. I dialed her number. Down below, I saw Beatrice flinch. She fumbled in her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. "I'm here," she said, her voice shaking violently. "Where are you?" "I'm looking right at you, Beatrice," I said calmly. "And I'm looking at your 2 friends, the one by the kiosk and the one by the escalator." She froze. Her head snapped toward the ticketing kiosks, a fatal betrayal of her own lie. I had to," she stammered, the panic rising in her throat again. "Victor insisted. He wouldn't let me leave with the money without an escort. I swear, if you just tell me where to bring it." "Shut up and listen to me," I barked, cutting her off. "The deal has changed." "No, please. Shut up. Look down at your feet." She tilted her head downward. "There's a trash can 3 feet to your left," I said. "Walk over to it." She hesitated, her knuckles white on the handles of the duffel bag. Slowly, she shuffled 3 steps to her left. "Drop the bag in the trash can," I ordered. "Are you crazy? There's $2 million in here. Drop it, or the New York Times gets the email in exactly 60 seconds. She let out a choked sob. Her hands shook uncontrollably. With agonizing slowness, she lifted the heavy leather bag over the rim of the metal bin and let it drop. It landed on top of half-eaten sandwiches and empty coffee cups with a heavy, muted thud. "Now walk away," I said. "Walk toward the east exit and don't look back." "You have to give me the drive," she pleaded, tears finally spilling out from under her sunglasses, carving tracks through her expensive makeup. "I did what you asked. I gave you the money. Give me the drive, or I am a dead woman." "You were a dead woman the moment you handed Victor Caldwell a shovel to bury those children," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. "I read the logs, Beatrice. I know exactly how many families you paid off to keep quiet about the poisoned water. I know you orchestrated the hits on the whistleblowers. I was just doing my job," she cried, into the phone, her voice cracking. "Victor gave the orders. If I didn't handle the logistics, he would have found someone else. You think I wanted to poison those people? You think I wanted to bury those barrels? Gotcha." I hit the small red square on the screen of the burner phone, stopping the voice recording app. I had routed the call on the burner through an internal recording software. I didn't need the money. I needed a confession. The documents were circumstantial for her. She could claim her signature was forged, that she was just a secretary, unaware of the grand design. But this was a spoken, panicked confession to environmental terrorism and accessory to murder. "Walk away, Beatrice," I said quietly, and hung up. I watched her stand there for a few seconds, trembling. Then she turned and half ran toward the east exit, pushing through the crowd. I didn't stay to watch what happened next. I knew the two goons wouldn't let $2 million sit in a trash can. I knew they would move in to secure the bag, completely abandoning their post and blowing whatever cover they had left. I turned away from the railing, pulled the brim of my cap down lower, and walked toward the train platforms. The air smelled heavy with exhaust and rain, but for the first time since waking up on that park bench, my lungs felt clear. The heavy lifting was done. Now, I just had to press send one last time. It all fell apart in a matter of hours. I was sitting in a dimly lit dive bar on the edge of the city, miles away from Union Station. The place smelled of stale beer, lemon floor cleaner, and crushed dreams. There were only 3 other patrons, silent, hunched men, staring into their glasses. I had my pawnshop laptop open on the sticky, scarred wooden table in the back booth. I had connected to the bar's unsecured Wi-Fi. 10 minutes ago, I had attached the entire, unredacted contents of the micro SD card to a mass email. The financial ledgers, the bribery logs, the organizational charts, and, as the final nail in the coffin, the audio recording of Beatrice Thorne crying about burying barrels and following orders. I sent it to the FBI field office, the EPA regional director, the state attorney general, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and, just for good measure, Arthur Penhaligon. Then, I ordered a neat whiskey, closed the laptop, and waited. I didn't have to wait long. The television above the bar, previously showing a muted baseball game, switched to a breaking news alert. This wasn't a local broadcast anymore. This was national. Federal raid at Caldwell Enterprises headquarters. Helicopter footage showed a fleet of black armored vehicles surrounding the gleaming glass tower downtown. Dozens of agents in tactical gear were pouring into the lobby. The bartender, a burly man with a thick beard and a dirty apron, picked up the remote and unmuted the TV. Unprecedented sweeping indictments against Victor Caldwell and his executive board. A frantic news anchor was saying, pressing a hand to her earpiece. Sources inside the Justice Department are citing a massive, anonymous data leak that implicates the billionaire in money laundering, environmental terrorism, and potentially multiple homicides linked to a cover-up. The footage cut from the helicopter to a ground-level shot outside Caldwell's sprawling suburban estate. My chest tightened. The heavy iron gates of the mansion were open. FBI agents were swarming the lawn, and there, walking down the front steps in handcuffs, surrounded by a wall of federal windbreakers, was Victor Caldwell. He didn't look untouchable anymore. He looked old. He looked small. His bespoke suit was wrinkled, his face pale and slack with shock. The flashbulbs of the press cameras exploded around him, capturing the exact moment a king realized his empire had turned to dust. A few seconds later, a smaller inset window appeared on the screen. It was Beatrice. They were pulling her out of an unmarked car outside a police precinct. She was still wearing the trench coat. Her makeup was smeared across her face, and she looked completely catatonic, staring blankly ahead as agents guided her through the mob of reporters. "Well, I'll be damned," the bartender muttered, leaning against the tap handles. "Bastard finally got caught. Hope they bury him under the jail." I didn't say anything. I just stared at the screen. In my past life, those two people had orchestrated my murder without ever knowing my name. They had treated my existence as a rounding error, a minor obstacle in their grand, toxic machinery. I had died cold, confused, and terrified, bleeding out over a piece of cheap plastic. Now, I was sitting in a warm booth, drinking whiskey, watching them lose everything. I took a slow sip of the amber liquid. It burned its way down my throat, settling warm in my stomach. I thought I would feel triumphant. I thought I would feel like a hero who had slayed the dragon. But the truth was far more complicated, far more human. I felt hollowed out. Rebirth isn't a reset button. It doesn't erase the trauma. It just gives you a chance to redirect it. I still remembered the agonizing pain of the bullet. I would always remember it. Victor Caldwell's arrest didn't heal the scar on my soul. Beatrice's tears didn't make my hands stop trembling when I thought about that dark warehouse. But as I watched Caldwell's head get shoved into the back of a federal cruiser, a different kind of feeling slowly washed over me. It wasn't joy. It was peace. The ledger was balanced. The ghost had exacted its toll. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the micro SD card, and dropped it into my glass of whiskey. I watched the tiny piece of black plastic sink to the bottom, magnifying slightly through the amber liquid in the thick glass. I pulled out a $50 bill, slid it under my empty glass, and stood up. I packed up the cheap laptop, slung my duffel bag over my shoulder, and walked out of the dim, sour-smelling bar. The rain had stopped. The night air was cool, washed clean of the oppressive summer heat and the smog of the city. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs until they ached slightly. I didn't know where I was going to go tomorrow. I didn't know who I was going to be now that the fire was out. But for the first time in 2 lifetimes, my time belonged entirely to me. I stepped off the curb and started walking into the dark, listening to the rhythm of my own steady heartbeat. Alive. Finally. Truly alive. Thank you for listening to the end of this journey. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat and you loved watching the protagonist tear down an empire to balance the scales, show your support by hitting that like button right now. Please share this video with anyone who loves a gritty, satisfying revenge thriller. And make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss our upcoming stories. Drop a comment below. Would you have taken the $2 million? Or would you have burned them down just like our protagonist did? See you next time.